At the age of 11, he fell in love with the saxophone. At the age of 20, he was at the forefront of a modern jazz music revolution. At the age of 34, he was dead from the effects of prolonged drug and alcohol abuse. But today, Charlie Parker is considered one of the greatest musical innovators of the 20th century and regarded as one of the founding fathers of bebop. Charlie Parker was one of the most important figures in the development of jazz, and in particular, bebop. He was a troubled man, with drugs and alcohol at the heart of his problems. He was also a genius, a man that changed the course of jazz history. Charles Parker Jr. hailed from the jazz scene that was Kansas City, Missouri, right about the same time that jazz was catching fire, in part thanks to the Harlem Renaissance in New York City. Born on August 29, 1920, to a teenage mother, Charlie, by all accounts, had a decent childhood, despite his father being more interested in gambling than parenting. By the time he was 14, Parker was living in the jazz district of Kansas City, and his father had left, leaving his doting mother to bring up Charlie. He was obsessed with music and the life of the musicians he saw around 12th Street and Vine. Eventually, his mother scraped together enough to buy Parker a beaten-up second-hand alto sax. By the time he was 16, Parker had withdrawn from high school and was playing around Kansas City clubs wherever and whenever he could. Even this early in his career, his love of improvisation drove him. Not yet 16 and still living with his mother, Parker married his high school sweetheart, Rebecca Ruffin. That November, he traveled with a group to the Lake of the Ozarks to play at a club. On the trip, the car Parker was in wrecked, causing severe injuries to his spine and ribs. The accident led to Parker's ultimate troubles with painkillers and opioids, especially heroin. Parker struggled with drug use for the rest of his life. Parker became a celebrity in Kansas City when he began playing shows for local radio stations. Although he cleaned up his act for a time after the birth of his son in 1938, Parker's addiction soon made him unreliable and hard to work with. He was unfaithful to Rebecca and became abusive towards her, so his mother kicked him out of the house. Homeless and jobless, Parker left for New York in 1939. In 1942, jazz musician Thelonious Monk saw Parker perform with a band in Harlem and was impressed by his unique playing style. Later that year, Parker signed up for an 8-month gig with Earl Hines' band and collaborated closely with another bebop pioneer, trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie. Later on, Gillespie and Parker would go on to perform and record with other emerging bebop artists such as trumpeter Miles Davis, bassist Curly Russell and Charles Mingus, and pianists Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell. Together, these jazz artists started a musical revolution. In 1944, Parker joined the Billy Eckstine Band. It didn't last long, and by late 1944, Bird was on his own, although he spent most of his time playing with Dizzy Gillespie in 52nd Street clubs. Recording was impossible, as there was a musicians' union ban in force until September 1944. Parker joined a group of young musicians and played in after-hours clubs in Harlem, such as Clark Monroe's Uptown House. These young artists included Gillespie, pianist Thelonious Monk, guitarist Charlie Christian, and drummer Kenny Clark. At the Savoy Ballroom, Charlie began to get serious recognition from other musicians, especially at some after-hours sessions. Not that everyone got what Parker was up to. There was none of the smoothness of regular swing bands in what Charlie played. Many just heard it as notes in some random order. The following year in June, he recorded with trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie, pianist Thelonious Monk, Curly Russell on bass, and Buddy Rich. These songs made up the classic recording Bird and Diz. By 1945, Parker and Gillespie's band were much in demand, and in early 1946, they toured California, but Bird would frequently disappear when they had gigs. Dizzy managed around the problem by taking musician Milt Jackson with them to sub in for when Charlie went AWOL. As well as the 6-week booking at Billy Berg's, they played jazz at the Philharmonic, along with Lester Young. In true Parker fashion, he even arrived late for the performance at the Philharmonic Auditorium, walking on stage during a piano solo. Gillespie asked, "Where you been?" Parker let his sax do the talking. Before we dive deeper into Charlie Bird's story, would you please take a moment to support this channel by subscribing and hitting the thumbs up button? Leave a comment too. I would really appreciate it. Now, back to the story. Most of the group returned to New York, but Parker remained in California, cashing in his return ticket to buy heroin. He experienced great hardship in California and was briefly jailed after setting the bedsheets of his Los Angeles hotel room on fire and then running naked through the lobby while intoxicated, after which he was committed to the Camarillo State Mental Hospital for 6 months. When Parker received his discharge from the hospital, he was clean and healthy. Before leaving California, he recorded "Relaxin' at Camarillo" in reference to his stay in the mental hospital. However, when he returned to New York, he resumed his heroin usage. At a session in March with a septet that included Miles Davis and Lucky Thompson, Parker cut "Yardbird Suite" and "A Night in Tunisia." It was a pivotal moment in modern jazz. By the next session in July, Charlie's heroin supplier had been arrested, and Parker had moved on to gin. But by February 1947, he was back in the studio sounding better than ever. He recorded "Stupendous," "Cool Blues," and "Bird's Nest." These sides are arguably the cornerstone of Parker's career. Early in its development, this new type of jazz was rejected by many of the established traditional jazz musicians who disdained their younger counterparts. Because of the 2-year Musicians' Union ban of all commercial recordings from 1942 to 1944, much of bebop's early development was not captured for posterity. As a result, it gained limited radio exposure. Bebop musicians had a difficult time gaining widespread recognition. It was not until 1945, when the recording ban was lifted, that Parker's collaborations with Dizzy Gillespie, Max Roach, Bud Powell, and others had a substantial effect on the jazz world. Though the experiments in jazz were being heard worldwide, in the United States much of the popular media ignored the music. There was no serious attention paid to Charlie Parker as a great creative musician in any of the media. In late 1950, there was a visit to Europe, and Parker, at last, seemed to be getting his life under control, even if the drugs and booze were never entirely absent. Parker's band was great around this time, featuring a young John Coltrane and wowing audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. It was not until his tour of Europe that Parker began to receive the attention he deserved. Visiting Paris, Parker was greeted with an almost cult-like status. However, as continuing personal and creative pressures mounted, he went into a tailspin. Drinking, behaving erratically, and even being banned from Birdland, the legendary 50 East 2nd Street club named in his honor. Throughout this time, however, one thing remained intact. Parker's playing continued to exhibit the same technical genius and emotional investment that had made him great. With the success of bebop, Charlie Parker's reputation as a musician grew. However, his addictions to drugs and alcohol, along with his emotional instability, continued to sabotage his success. He was constantly out of money and often resorted to selling his saxophone to get money for drugs. He married 3 more times and had 3 more children. He was regularly late or failed to show up at all for recording sessions and performances, and his addictions often caused his playing to suffer. By the time of his death, Parker had been hospitalized several times due to both physical and mental illnesses, and had attempted suicide twice. In 1954, while working again in California, Parker learned of the death of his 2-year-old daughter and went into further decline. He separated from his then common-law wife, John Parker, and was reduced to playing in dives. The red wine he had become addicted to was exacerbating his stomach ulcers. Though Parker was a titan among jazz musicians of the time, it would take the country at large years to learn that for a short while in the 1940s and 1950s, one of the most profoundly original American musicians had walked among them, virtually unrecognized. Parker died on March 12, 1955, in the apartment of a friend and patron. The official causes of death were pneumonia and a bleeding ulcer. But Parker also had an advanced case of cirrhosis and had suffered a heart attack. The coroner who performed his autopsy mistakenly estimated Parker's 34-year-old body to be between 50 and 60 years of age. Dizzy Gillespie paid for the funeral arrangements and organized a Harlem procession officiated by Congressman and Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. His body was then flown back to Missouri in accordance with his mother's wishes. Parker's family gave him a Christian funeral, even though they knew he was a confirmed atheist. He was laid to rest at Lincoln Cemetery in Missouri. When Charlie Parker, who was a legendary figure during his lifetime, has if anything grown in stature since his death. Despite his short life, Parker is widely cited as one of the most innovative and influential musicians in American history. He has won several posthumous awards, including a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to American music. Parker's influence, after the rise of John Coltrane, has become more indirect than direct, but jazz would sound a great deal different if Charlie Parker had not existed. This is Donovan from One Track Jazz. Thanks for watching.